Alright everybody, welcome to your first U.S. History Flip the Classroom screencast from this semester. You can see we're talking about U.S. History Objective 1.02, and now we've talked about the domestic issues in the country, and now we're talking about who didn't have political rights in the nation. So you can see this says we're talking about freedoms available to women, wage earners, landless farmers, American Indians, African Americans, and other ethnic groups prior to 1820. And the big answer to that is there wasn't any political freedom available to these groups. Starting out talking about women in the New Republic. They were very important, but they couldn't vote, they couldn't hold office, but they were important in one way. There's that early idea of Republican motherhood. And that was the belief that since you didn't really have a public school system, it was the mother that taught the child the values they needed to be a productive citizen in an American democratic society. So Republican motherhood means they had to instill all these values and reverence for people like the Founding Fathers and the future generations, so they would grow up to be good American citizens. And over time, doors did open for women's education, but the key thing I want you to remember about early American women is that they were very depended on to teach children what it meant to be an American citizen. The founders did not give women many rights, but they did speak about from time to time. They did care, and that picture of the Founding Fathers right there, the one we know the most about his views about women's rights was this guy right here, John Adams, because we got a lot of his correspondence with his wife, Abigail Adams. I've got here that Abigail Adams says that she desires that he would be more generous to the ladies and more favorable than their ancestors. She's writing this when he and his fellow Founding Fathers were creating the Declaration of Independence, when they're creating the Articles of Federation and the Constitution. Right here she says, she cannot say that she thinks you're very generous to the ladies, for while you proclaim peace and goodwill to men, emancipating all nations, you insist upon retaining absolute power over your wives. So the Founding Fathers were hearing in their ears too from their wives, particularly women like Abigail Adams, that women needed more rights in a democratic society. In this painting of Abigail Adams, you can see that she's drawn with painted with a very, very pale face, which back then was considered a sign of beauty, because if you had a pale face and you were a woman, it meant that you had a nice enough life that you didn't really have to work outside. Which is, a little ironic, since today girls want to go to the tanning bed and things like that before the prom. Back then they wanted to do everything they could to look as pale as they could. In some states, women were given the right to hold property with their husband's permission, but by 1777, I've got here that even the states that originally had it had taken away women's right to vote. And that's a word right there that we'll talk about a lot this semester, suffrage. Sounds like suffer, but I want you to make sure you know that women's suffrage means women's right to vote. We talk about suffrage requirements on your quiz tomorrow. We're talking about requirements to vote. In 1848, there was a big step towards women's rights at the Seneca Falls Convention in New York, but the goal that women had of getting the right to vote didn't come around until the 19th Amendment in 1920. So we know that women were important for raising good citizens. They didn't really hold property. They couldn't vote. So they were pretty much one of the bottom rungs of society in early America. Granted, they were above certain ethnic groups, like slaves. When I look at this picture, I always notice the tight waist that she's got bound up, also the very pale face there, and that's got to be about the most uncomfortable outfit any girl could pick for herself. During the French Revolution, there was a little push towards women showing a little bit more skin, which right here you see the kind of low-cut dresses, but you still notice these women are very pale. But even going back to this last one, you can tell how much that dress covers. This is a world away from where we are in the 2000s, where back then, if a woman showed an ankle in public, she might be thought of as being a woman of ill repute. The next group I've got listed here says wage earners. All right, wage earners were basically people that worked that weren't farmers. And I've got here by 1800, 1 out of 6 Americans were not farmers, but it also means 5 out of 6 Americans were farmers. So the factory system is starting to spread, probably not as quickly as Alexander Hamilton would have liked, but it starts in New England, spreads down to the middle colonies, and it doesn't really come to the South until after the Civil War. But up until the mid-1820s, most of these what we call wage earners, or low-level employees at the manufacturing firms and factories, they couldn't vote. It wasn't until the election of 1828 when Jackson was elected that these white men were allowed to vote, because there were property qualifications. Meaning you didn't have to only be white and a man, you also had to be a white man who owned property. And these factory laborers were not paid very well. This is long before there was ever a minimum wage. That doesn't come around until the 1930s. And most of these early wage earners gave their political support to the Federalists. You know, the Federalists were the ones that worked for things like a protective tariff that would give some help to New England industry. But over time, some of these wage earners started to shift towards supporting the Democratic-Republican Party because they realized that the Democratic-Republicans were anti-banking, which they didn't trust banks. They were anti-British, which was their competition, and pro-French Revolution, which would do a lot to make these wage earners think that there is something they can do to improve their lot in the world. All right, and workers didn't organize very much early on. There were some kind of collective assistance groups that weren't a whole lot like modern labor unions. It's not going to be for about another 100 years before we're talking about a lot of labor unions in the late 1800s. There were a few strikes, and a few strikes did become violent, but in general, labor was not very organized at this time. The next group is landless farmers, and I've got there, it says, if you ain't got it, you ain't getting it when it comes to land. Land was expensive early in the Republic, and land was also not always sold to everybody that wanted it. And I've got especially after the cotton gin. These people here in this picture are probably farmers from the Whiskey Rebellion. I'm assuming that's probably a tax collector who's getting choked down to a creek. These are the kinds of landless farmers that we're talking about at the time. For American Indians, I don't think I need to explain very much about how the American government had treated Native Americans poorly for years and years. That's something you probably remember all the way back from middle school. In 1763, Great Britain tried to issue a proclamation saying that no settlers could move west of the Appalachians just to prevent conflict with Native Americans. That didn't work. There was a rebellion by Western farmers in Virginia called Bacon's Rebellion that they thought the Eastern government wasn't doing enough to protect them from Native Americans. So there was a long history of conflict between Native Americans and American citizens. Then, after the invention of Eli Whitney's cotton gin, settlers wanted even more of Native American Indians' land. All right, the cotton gin's a machine that Eli Whitney actually kind of had it backfire on him. He tried to make this so that de-seeding cotton would be an easier process for the slaves, so they wouldn't have to pick through all these seeds. They could just dump the cotton into a machine like this, and I'll come back to that last slide, but the slaves would turn the cotton through the teeth of this cotton gin. It would de-seed the cotton, and then all of a sudden you've got the effect of the cotton being de-seeded and slaves without hours of tedious labor. But it actually had the opposite effect. This had two big effects. It made farmers want more slaves because they wanted to grow more cotton. It also made farmers want to take more land from Native Americans in what was then the Southwest, which we would call like Mississippi, Alabama today, because there was very rich, dark soil that was great for growing cotton. If you look at this map, this blue area down here, these are the states that were encroached upon by farmers after the invention of the cotton gin. So one big thing I want you to remember about the cotton gin and Eli Whitney's invention is that slavery was kind of on the road to dying out at this point. It wasn't as profitable for some farmers as they would have liked, but after the invention of the cotton gin, slavery gets a little bit of a boost where they want more land so they can grow more cotton since it can be de-seeded so much faster. And as the American government moved in, they consistently broke treaties with Native Americans they made. There's a big word there that I probably didn't learn until college, but y'all are learning in high school. Abrogation. It means they broke their treaties. The American government would consistently tell Native Americans, okay, you can have this land. And they would push them a little further west. Say, well, we're going to take this land too. Now you're going to take this. Eventually, what we would call Oklahoma was called Indian Territory, and then that was even taken from Native Americans. So most Native Americans most Americans, white Americans from the East, did not see Native Americans as their fellow citizens. They saw them more as an obstacle, something that was in their way. They're kind of forgetting that Native Americans were there first. But on the frontier, there were constantly what the government would call Native American problems. And I've got here with the Treaty of Greenville in 1796, Miami Indian Confederacy agreed to give up most of the current state of Ohio for $20,000 as well as $10,000 a year. This gave the U.S. control of the Northwest Territory. And you can see in this picture on the slide, looks like American military officers signing a treaty with Native American leaders. But not all Native Americans were so willing to sign treaties. I've heard his name as Tecumseh, I've heard Tecumseh, but this Shawnee war chief here, he felt like the only way to keep Native Americans on their own lands was to actively fight against the Americans. He wanted to bind all Native American tribes together in a big confederacy, and he traveled around different tribes and tried to form one of these confederacies. But in 1809, there was a treaty called the Treaty of Fort Wayne that angered Tecumseh because several of his fellow Native Americans had given away some of their lands. He says he won't follow it, and he's actually gone away traveling, trying to convince more Native Americans to join his confederacy when his brother, a guy named the Prophet, he was a holy man, he led the Shawnee against the U.S. Army at the Battle of Tippecanoe. Now, it's not called the Battle of Tippecanoe because that's how Native Americans won the battle, or excuse me, the Army won the battle. It's called the Battle of Tippecanoe because it's fought near Tippecanoe Creek, and this creates an American hero in itself, General William Henry Harrison, who would eventually go on to become a president. He was actually our shortest-lived president because he was only president for a month before he died from pneumonia after giving a 2-hour inaugural address in the freezing rain. The last group we're going to talk about today, I think people have heard since middle school about what life was like under slavery. We're going to talk about that a lot this semester, but most African Americans in the United States at this time were slaves. Slaves were seen as property and they could not vote. And after the invention of the cotton gin, which I already mentioned, you know, the increased demand for slaves made it so that slavery didn't look like it was going to die out anytime soon. Congress did outlaw the importation of slaves in 1808. So they didn't say you couldn't sell slaves anymore. They just said you could not bring any new slaves into the United States. This shows slaves emptying the cotton gin right there. And there were some free African Americans, but even free African Americans faced a lot of prejudices and discrimination. There was still no right to vote, even for the free African Americans at the time. But there were Americans that saw dark clouds on the horizon and that this issue of slavery might one day be a big issue for the United States. And one of those people was Thomas Jefferson. You see here Thomas Jefferson, who we've already talked about, owned slaves. We said that he probably had affairs with his slaves. But despite this, he still felt slavery was wrong. Now, I know that sounds hypocritical of him. But he wrote a letter that we call the Firebell in the Night letter, in which he said that one day slavery would wake America up like a firebell in the night. If you were a fireman at that time, you hear a firebell in the middle of the night, you know you spring out of bed in a hurry. Well, this Firebell in the Night letter said that slavery was a wolf by the ears. It's not something you wanted to have in America, but also not something you could get rid of very easily either. So even slave owners like Jefferson realized this was a problem that would one day come to bite Americans in the butt. And it's over the Missouri Compromise 1820, he writes that letter, which we'll get to next week. All right, make sure you go online and fill out the Google form about this little podcast here and know all this stuff for class tomorrow.